So, you recently got accepted into architect school. Congratulations! Well, in this video I'm going to be showing you guys some of the things you need to buy before starting, and I'll be explaining some of the places you can save money and some of the places where it's worth spending a bit more money on the equipment you're going to use, as these will last you out throughout the whole of architecture school. So let's get into it. Now, I've already gone through all the products we're going to talk to and found the best value for money and some of the highest quality ones I recommend. There'll be links for all of them in the description, and these cost absolutely nothing extra for you to buy from my links, but they do help support the channel, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them. Now, let's get into it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is mechanical pencils, something that every architect has. I recommend people getting a 0.3mm lead, a 0.5mm lead, and a 0.7mm lead. These have 3 different thicknesses and allow you to get a varying line weight in your drawings. Now, as far as brands, I used to use Rotring. I do recommend these, but I've had 1 or 2 issues in the past, so now I use Kurga-Toga. I think this pen is absolutely great, and the Kurga-Toga pencil, every time you press on the lead, it slightly rotates, and this stops you getting single-sided slants on your leads. Now, another thing to also consider is lead softness. Now, these range from 9H to about 9B, and HB being the center, which is the standard lead of most pencils. B leads are more softer, and they'll give a darker color, but they can also smudge a bit more. And H leads are harder, and they're more likely to snap, but they give a really pen-like line. Now, the softness of your lead is personal preference. I like using either a HB or a 2B. A 2B gives me a nice amount of shading, and I can use it in most things, and a HB gives me a pretty basic line that is less likely to smudge, and is great for just taking notes. Now, although most mechanical pencils have a rubber on the end, I recommend you buy your own rubbers. You can use either a kneadable eraser or a normal standard rubber, and I personally am using this Rotring one. Now, a rubber is one of the places where I'd recommend you want to spend a bit more money, because if you're spending a lot of time doing a drawing and you need to rub something out, a low quality eraser can damage the paper and it can smudge your drawing. You really want a high quality rubber that's going to save you time in the long run. Again, there'll be links for some examples of these in the description. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is pens. I personally love the Staedtler pigment liners. Now, I use these for everything, but I also have a number of others, such as the Uniball pen, or even things like Pilot permanent markers that give me a thicker line, or even Beryl fine liner pens. I'll leave all of these in the description, and a lot of this is down to personal preference. You want a good fine liner that you can use for a lot of drawings, and these are great if you're drawing on things like trace. They scan much better, and they just give a much cleaner line when you're doing drawings. As I've said, I personally love the Staedtler brand, and I even have an entire pot of coloured ones on my desk. Now, quick note regarding fine liners. A lot of architects used to use something called tech pens. Now, tech pens are technical pens, but they're really hard to use, and they're quite expensive. Tech pens have a metal rod going down the tip, and what this ensures is that the tip doesn't get bent at all. But to be honest, you're better off getting a felt liner because they're cheaper, they're better quality, the ink is darker, and if you do need to replace them, they're quite cheap to just buy a new pack. I always have about 2 or 3 packs of these spare if anything goes wrong. Now, I'm going to be talking about a scale ruler next. Scale ruler is one of the most common apparatuses used by an architect. They show different measurements for different scales. So for example, I can see here 5 centimeters would be at this line, but if I changed it to here, in scale 1 to 100, that would be 5 meters. There are 2 types of scale rulers that you need to know. These are engineering rulers and architect scale rulers. Now, if you're doing architecture, I would recommend getting an architect's ruler, and these tend to have different types of scales on them. Now, in the UK, engineers' rulers tend to have scales such as 1 to 300 and 1 to 30. These are never used in architecture because they're not very universal and they're quite hard to scale up. So, if you're going to architecture, use an architect's ruler. Now, one thing else you can use is you can also get a metal one, and what this will allow you to do is it will allow you to use a scalpel against it, so when you're measuring out things to cut for, say, models, you don't end up cutting your ruler, because I myself have got a number of cuts on the edge of this where I've cut a scalpel next to it. Now, talking about accidentally cutting your ruler, the next thing I'm going to recommend is a metal safety ruler. These have a nice ridge down the middle to rest your fingers in and are really stable when you're doing scalpel work. Now, this metal ruler is super durable, and I've dropped it all over the place and it's still completely intact. Now this metal ruler also has inches on one side and centimeters on the other, just in case I ever need to convert between the two. If you buy a metal ruler, you should never need to replace it ever. Same with your scale ruler. Talking about a scalpel, here is the scalpel I use. It is a craft scalpel. It's not designed for surgical use, and it's really great because the blades are very easy to just take off and replace. Now, many people when they're doing model making tend to use something like a box cutter. These work great for certain materials, but I personally prefer a scalpel just because they're a lot more versatile and the blades can get a lot sharper. Especially if you're cutting things like foams, these really wear down blades, and therefore it's really useful having something like this because you can get a big box of blades for quite cheap, whereas a box cutter, you'll have to keep snapping off your blade and then you'll run out of the blade very quick. These scalpels are also really small and they can be really carefully put inside a pencil case, and I like to keep mine wrapped or covered with a plastic top just so it doesn't accidentally cut anything. These are really sharp, they're really useful, and I use it so much. Having a really sharp blade is absolutely crucial to having a clean model, and this scalpel has a number of different shaped blades that I can also replace on top, and therefore it allows me to do loads of different cuts. Things like square blades that are great for doing corners, and things like this blade that I use for most things that's great for doing nice clean cuts. Now, also talking about cutting things, I would also recommend a good pair of scissors. Now, I don't use these that much, and I tend to use a scalpel for most things, but it's really useful to just have them on hand for things like cutting tracing paper and other materials you might want to use. I just recommend a simple, good pair that's got a nice sharp blade and that's comfortable for you to use. Now, the next thing I recommend is good glue. I personally like Yoo-Hoo all-purpose adhesive. It's really strong stuff. It's great for model making. It can get a little bit messy, but you can use any form of type of two-part adhesive, craft glue, and keep in mind you may need different glues for different materials. For example, Yoo-Hoo do something called PUR glue, which is better for foams because the chemicals in this glue can melt foam or foam core if you're using it, so just make sure you're using the right glue for the job. But this is a great all-purpose adhesive that works great for wood, card, other materials that you're most likely to use. Now, the next thing that's absolutely crucial is masking tape. I use this so much. Now, in architecture, you'll find yourself doing a lot of tracing, iterative design, and you want to be sticking pieces of tracing paper on top of each other, and you can change designs as you go. The way you're going to hold these down is masking tape. Masking tape allows you to do this without damaging the paper, and it's much easier to pull off than any form of other tape, or even blue tack. Masking tape is also great because you can draw on it, and you can even do things like putting a piece of tape on the table and drawing a measurement you want on it and then cutting things to that specific length. It's really versatile and it's a great thing for everyone to have. I always have, again, 1 or 2 rolls at home just in case I run out of one. Now, as I've just mentioned, the next thing I'm going to talk about is tracing paper. This is a roll of tracing paper, and you will find that you'll be using this absolutely loads in your architectural design process. The current roll I have is 63 GSM. Now, GSM stands for grams per square meter. Now, you can get lower GSMs, which come in bigger rolls and are much cheaper, but you'll find they're very thin and tear really easily. I find that 63 GSM is a really nice medium, and it's thick enough that you can have some weight to it, but it's thin enough that it rolls up easy and doesn't take up too much space. Now, I didn't realize how much I'd use tracing paper in my architectural design process, and I initially started by buying pre-cut A3 sheets. These are really great if you're doing some form of final presentation, but again, I just did not realize how much would go through, and therefore I end up buying a roll because it's much more cost effective, and I promise you will use it. Another great thing about tracing paper is if you use a fine liner, they're really great to scan and you can easily change the levels. I have a tutorial on how to do this here to create a simple transparent background with your pen work on. These are really great in your work, and lecturers love to see hand-drawn stuff, so I really recommend drawing on tracing paper so you can scan it in. Now, the next thing I'm talking about is triangles. Now, this is another place I made a mistake at in first year. I bought these really small triangles, and then I realized that they were too small and I needed to get some bigger ones, which I now use whenever we're doing hand drawing. These are especially crucial at the start of the year when there's a big focus on hand drawing, and they allow you to do things like isometric drawings because they are 30 degrees here and 60 degrees on this side, allowing you to do isometric and axonometric drawings. And when you're using a drawing board, you can rest them on them and you get perfect angles. I highly recommend getting a big pair, and you just want a simple plastic pair that you can look after. Now I have broken mine, but I've just taped it together and it works fine. Again, there's going to be links for all examples of all of this in the description, so go check them out if you're interested. Now, I just mentioned the drawing board. A drawing board is a large surface that you draw on with a ruler that moves up and down. Now, I myself had mine provided by my university in first year, so I have returned it, and I haven't recently bought a new one since because I personally do a lot more digital, but I really recommend if you want to do a lot of hand drawing, it's a great thing to buy just because it's so versatile and it's really useful. And now the last thing I think you need to buy, and that is a cutting mat. I have an A4 cutting mat as well as an A2 cutting mat and an A3 cutting mat. These are absolutely great, and this A4 one stays in my bag at all times just because it's really portable and it's great if I want to cut something. The larger one tends to stay at home, and when I'm doing model making, I'll put it on my desk and then I can just cut anywhere without worrying. A lot of cutting mats have a grid on them, and therefore you can cut specific centimeters without a ruler. If you're like me, first year you'd occasionally use a scalpel on your desk, which is really not a good idea because you end up with cuts everywhere. So I really recommend a self-healing cutting mat. They're not too expensive and they really protect your work surface. Okay, now we've gone through all the stuff that I think you need to buy. There's a couple of other things that you might want to buy based on your style. Now, the first of that is a good set of coloured pencils. I personally absolutely recommend Prismacolor. They're really high quality, they've got great amount of pigment and they blend really nice. Now, they're not too cheap, but I think it's better with colouring pencils to get good quality ones because they really do make your work look that much better. On those same lines, another form of art medium I recommend is either a good paint or a good watercolour. A lot of architecture presentation is about finding your own style. If you are very creative and you have a very artistic style, you probably already have these equipment, but I really recommend them if you want to experiment with things like watercolour because they can really make you stand out in terms of presentation. And finally, the last one is a white gel pen. Now, if you use a lot of different coloured cards or different materials, white is great looking on loads of different materials, whether that be black card, brown card, or just anything dark or earth toned. White pens can stand out great and they give a nice contrast to the normal black pen or pencil that everyone uses. And guys, that is it for everything I think you need to buy if you're starting architecture. For the guys that are already doing architecture, is there anything you think I've missed? Is there anything you recommend more than others? Leave it in the comments, I'd love to read it and you might help someone else. Please remember, in the description are links to all recommendations that I give. They don't cost anything extra, but they do help the channel. And as always guys, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. Hopefully you found it helpful, and I'll catch you guys in another video. Have a nice day.